Hi, everyone. This is Jason Barak of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest, but I found his book a year ago. It's a very famous book in the gold community. He's an American author, lecturer, and filmmaker. He's the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. I believe it was published in 1994. G Edward Griffin, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Now, Mr. Griffin, I'm a student of history, and we started talking before we started recording your book, before we started recording here, and your book, Creature from Jekyll Island, you seem to be, based on what I've read in the book, a student of history as well. When do you think things started to go off the rails in the U.S.? Was it in 1913?
You know, you could answer that in a lot of different ways. I think the honest and the scholarly answer, the historical answer, is it started to go off the rails almost immediately. I'm a great admirer of the Constitution. I think that it was a great inspired document, but I do not think it was perfect. I think it was the first time that man had tried to create a restraint, a legal restraint against governments. And if it was a beta model, there's no question about that. It was a beta model for something like that. It had never been done before in history, unless you want to consider the Magna Carta as the first step in that direction. But as far as a document, a founding document, a constitution, the law of the land, and that sort of thing, the American Constitution was the first beta model for that. And I think, considering that it was a beta model, and considering that it had to be it had to incorporate a lot of compromises because of the conflicting interests of the various 13 colonies and the things which had to be preserved, or else they would never get the consent of everybody. So there were a lot of things preserved from the old order that had to go into it just in order to get agreement. Considering all of those handicaps, it's amazing to me at how good it was. And it held us together. It put us on the right track, as you say, for a long, long time. We were going down a track pretty steadily for about 100 years. But the first vibrations, the first wobbling, the first deviations, I think can be traced back almost to the very first administration, because, as I said earlier, the Constitution itself was not perfect. And one of the things that I'm referring to is the fact that the Founding Fathers used, I think they used the wrong word in describing this thing they were attempting to create. The word that was used throughout the world at that time, certainly throughout Europe, was government. I mean, that is what the Founding Fathers were creating. People said, what kind of a government did you create? You know, that was the word. Any representation of state power, legalized use of coercion, was called government. And so it's certainly understandable that when Jefferson, Madison, Adams, and all the rest were putting together a document, they described it as a founding document for the new government. And I think that was a mistake in retrospect. It's easy for us to sit here way down the line of history and say that was a mistake. It would not have been so easy at the time. But the reason I say that is because if you think about what does government mean, it means to govern. And I would ask the Founding Fathers if they were here, and I certainly would ask any defenders of the Constitution who are here, does anybody in this room want to be governed by the state? And the answer, I think, would be unanimously no. No, we don't want to be governed. We want to be free. We want a state that's orderly. We want, the state to do certain things for us. We are the creators of this state. We will govern the state. We do not want to be governed by the state. And so I think, the whole purpose of government, by its definition, therefore, by the use of that word, the whole purpose of a government is to govern its citizens. And I think that's where we started to go off the track, right there at the very beginning with the use of that word. Now, that's sort of an academic way of looking at it. You could argue, well, the words can mean whatever you wish, and that is true. But we didn't wish them to mean anything else for a long, long time because we never challenged the implied or the subconscious definition of that word. And the question comes, well, what would you have used? What other word could you have used? And I think we could well have used the word a protectorate. Now, that has certain implications by the very meaning, too, by the very sound of the word. What is the purpose of a government? Well, it's to govern. What's the purpose of a protectorate? It's to protect. Wow, what a difference that is. And that was really what our founding fathers did create. They created a state that was designed to do only one thing primarily, and that was to protect the life, the liberty, and the property of its citizens, and nothing more. Right there in the preamble, it said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and it goes on down. It says that the purpose of this state is to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizens. It says so right there. And it doesn't say to govern them. It doesn't say to control their lives. It doesn't say anything to determine what they shall think, what clothes they should wear, what jobs they should work at, what prices they should pay for their goods, what kind of housing they should. No, none of that was in the Constitution. They did not create a government. They created a protectorate. So that is I think the proper answer to your question, but perhaps it's not satisfying because it doesn't seem to deal with the issues of today, but in a very real sense it does, because underneath all of the issues of today is the fact that this thing called the United States government has in fact become a true government, and it has reached out to govern every aspect of our lives, and including the choice of money, the value of our money, the interest rates that we pay on loans, everything. It governs everything, and that is where that's the root, I believe, the root cause of most of the problems which we face today. But now, in terms of this vibration and this rattling sound that grew and grew until finally it was like an earthquake in the ground beneath us that began to shake this republic apart, I think you can see that come to the surface, and it becomes pretty obvious during the Wilson administration. That is the period of time when things really hit the surface. People like Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was one of the founders of the Council on Foreign Relations, he moved into the White House, literally had 2 rooms in the White House in the Wilson administration, and he was Wilson's sort of secret advisor. Not so secret, he was visible, but nobody really realized until later how much direct and powerful influence he had over Wilson's political decisions. Anyway, it was this Edward Mandell House, this very mysterious person that was probably symbolic of the reality that collectivism, an ideology called collectivism, suddenly became the official ideology of the United States of America. Up until that time, people believed in their hearts that this was a system in which the people governed the state, that the officials, the public servants, so-called, were really public servants because they served the voters, they served the citizens. That was the concept up to the Wilson administration. It wasn't always that way, of course, but that's the lip service that everybody gave to it. That was the ideal. But after that, it changed. Then this thing called collectivism began to be taught in the schools, and the idea that the state was more important than the individual. And then finally that evolved into what we have today, full-blown collectivism, which is that the state is all-wise, all-powerful, and individuals should, in fact, serve the state. That's the only value of an individual, is to support and serve the state. The state became the new religion, the new leader, the new creator, the new everything. The state was all, the individual was nothing but a little cipher to serve it. So the second part of my answer to your question then is that I think the Wilson administration was the litmus paper test where the paper turned a change in color and you could see it. Not only was it there before, but now you could see it when you asked the question, what is the purpose of this state? People began to say, well, the purpose of the state is to defeat our enemies in World War I, for example. One of the great impetuses of this concept is that we have to sacrifice the individual now because we're fighting a terrible enemy. And by the time we get to World War II, that idea was even more rampant. Now we have another terrible enemy. Get rid of the individual unless he serves the state, the war effort, and defeat fascism. And then later on we had to defeat communism, and now we're defeating terrorism. All of these things we're having to defeat. And in order to do an effective job, we're told that we have to sacrifice our freedoms and our liberties as individuals so that we can defeat these terrible things. And in the process of doing that, we become the terrible thing which we're trying to defeat. So that's an ideological foundation for all of that. And I think all of these things are, in fact, ideological foundations built on them. It's not a question of personalities. It's not just Woodrow Wilson or Edward Mandell House or Roosevelt or Carter or Obama. It's not personalities. It's not political parties. It's not Republicans or Democrats. It's an ideology. This ideology X, as I call it, it's got a name really, and it's collectivism. So that's the long-winded answer to your question, but that's how I see it.
Yeah, I think that's a really great answer there. And, you brought up the Constitution. I mean, most people in their lives really prior to the progressive era in the United States, except for maybe wars and things like that, they rarely saw the government except when they were paying taxes, maybe a small amount of tax. I mean, the government was, before the progressive era started in the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s, most people barely saw the government in their everyday lives, and they still got along. But what we hear now is, people didn't get along at all. They didn't survive or do anything well until, government came along and did all these things. I mean, I've heard progressives now, Mr. Griffin, say that, there wouldn't be the restaurants, the food companies, everything would be polluted, or there would be, poison in everyone's food and stuff like that if there wasn't for all these government agencies protecting us and things like that. And it's like, well, before these government agencies were created, there were businesses that flourished and did fine and really didn't kill all their customers and things like that. So it just, I guess the history, you're a history fan, I'm a history fan. It seems like everything's been changed. But if we go back to our forefathers, right, with the stuff in the Constitution, like you said, they would be rolling over in their graves, seeing how, the Interstate Commerce Clause has been reinterpreted, the General Welfare Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause. I mean, the people, when they wrote the Constitution, they never thought that the legal interpretations for these things would basically give the government and the lawyers and the central planners and the people running the government now almost unlimited power.
Well, I think that's true in a general sense, but, some of them were kind of suspicious about that. I think Jefferson had an idea that there would be that legal twisting of concepts because he warned against it, and others did too. But in general, you're right. It was a concept that was maybe people were concerned about it, but they never thought it would go so quickly and so far as it did. Anytime you enter into a debate or a plain old argument on the playing field, on the playground, as a kid. When you get into differences of opinion, you have arguments and fights and that kind of thing, you begin to know that there is a power in twisting ideas, twisting thoughts, so that the indefensible becomes defensible because of some twisted logic or some made-up fabric of explanation. And by the time you go to law school, you perfect that art, and you become.
Yeah, that's why I dropped out of law school.
Yeah, that becomes the art. The highest achievement is to twist meanings using words. And the thing about the English language that I like so much is that there are so many different words for the same basic concept, but each of those words carries with it a slightly different innuendo or a slightly different shading of meaning, which makes it a rich language, and it allows you to think of concepts in different shades. And it's a really fine tool for thought, but it also is a fine tool for deception, because unless the listener is really alert to what's happening, the practitioner of this art can twist words and use different words that have slightly different shades of meaning, and first thing you know, the listener is deceived completely. So English can be used as a tool not of communication, but a tool of obfuscation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And most Americans now, unfortunately, a lot of them, 50%, I think the polls say 50% favor socialism to capitalism, even though they don't understand, what free markets and capitalism really is. They see crony capitalism and bailouts and things like that. And, a lot of people, they don't care. They haven't read your book. They don't listen to my podcast. They don't understand what's really going on in the markets with all the manipulation and things like that. They're too busy watching reality TV or going to the beach or watching, all these Kardashian shows and things like that. So I think people are so either brainwashed or don't care or things like that, it's very difficult to get the majority of people to understand what's really going on behind the scenes.
Well, it is, and that's a topic that I have mused over many, many times over the years. And I fluctuate between a harsh view, more or less as you just stated it, and a very sympathetic view, I guess depending on my mood and depending on who I happen to have run into a few minutes ago. But the reason I'm saying that is because I honestly believe that under other circumstances, I too could have been part of that group that uncritically accepts everything. I mean, it's part of the human being that he accepts information colored somewhat by the channels of information that he's receiving it. We get things from our parents and we think, well, that's true because they're our parents. Well, if we don't like our parents, then we rebel against them and say, well, that's not true because it's our parents. And then we go to school and they teach us things. Well, that's true because that's in school. Well, if we don't like school, then we say it's not true because that's in school and so forth. And it depends on our life experience and our role models and things like that. And so I don't really hold myself up as being a superior in any sense. I always think I really honestly believe that I'm just luckier because I had different exposures to different sources of information than other people. I think it's a question of just getting the people of the world exposed to the right information and presented in the right way so that so they don't accept that knee-jerk reaction, against certain words and ideas. It's a tough job, but I think most people innately are capable of understanding and grasping the truths that we're talking about if it's presented to them. I think that's our task, and that's the reason we're on the air right now, I suppose, is because we're trying to present this information in a way that people will not be repelled by it and give it a thought and think about it and compare it with their concepts that they already hold that are contrary to it, then make an intelligent judgment between the two.
Yeah, I think it has to do with open mind versus closed mind, because lots of people are plenty smart enough to be able to understand the concepts, from your book and about the Federal Reserve and how, they can inflate the money supply and fractional reserve banking and things like that. But I worked in the regular financial industry for a number of years, and when I try to explain to them, how the banking system basically works with the Mandrake mechanism and things like that, they look at me like I'm crazy conspiracy theorist, like I just invented all this stuff, I made it all up. But back to your comment about Woodrow Wilson and the Wilson era, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 for listeners who are not familiar. We also had the income tax created. We had a lot of industries that were also, cartelized. We had a lot of government agencies start to roll out then. We had, World War I, obviously. That's one of the justifications for the income tax along with the Federal Reserve. And pretty much since then, a lot of money has been funneled to a lot of new government agencies and crony capitalists. And, we've had these large corporations that, they're not they don't adhere to the laws of bankruptcy and things like that. So basically they're given all these free government contracts and unbidden and things like that. This is just insane that this continues for so long, and most people continue to blame it on capitalism.
Well, that's because, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's the channels of information that they're relying upon. They're hearing that through channels of communication that they respect, and they have no reason so far to question them. They hear that on the nightly news. They hear that in school. They hear that on the radio and on television. They hear it everywhere that this is what's going on. This is capitalism. Capitalism doesn't work. And they don't realize that they don't even know what capitalism is. They think that what we have in America today is capitalism. And, of course, there's nothing further from the truth than that. So it's just because people do not know definitions of words. And we're back to that topic again. They have no idea what capitalism is. You ask the average person that's down there demonstrating in the streets in front of the in front of Wall Street or some bank or some government agency, what is capitalism? And they'll say, well, they don't know how to answer that question. You get a different answer from every person you ask. And then you ask them, well, what is socialism? And they don't know the answer to that. You ask them, well, what does it mean to be a Republican? They don't know the answer to that. What does it mean to be a Democrat? Oh, I don't know. Everybody's got a different answer. It's what they feel. And they have no definitions of words, and therefore they cannot think.
This is very true. I completely agree with that. Now, you've been trying to promote freedom and telling people about the problems with the banking system and the Federal Reserve for a number of decades now. You were around during the stagflation in the 1970s, which should have killed Keynesian economics. Why has Keynesian economics survived then, including the 70s stagflation, in your opinion?
Well, I guess I hate to be talking about the same thing over again. It's because of words. Keynesian economics, how many people can define what that is? It survived. Well, I don't know whether it survived or not. What the heck is it? Well, once you understand what Keynesian economics is, and then you understand why it survived, it's because it's very profitable to those in power. Politicians and bankers would be out of business. They would certainly be very marginalized if Keynesian economics were not popular. If we went back to free market economics, then where would the politicians be? They wouldn't be able to fund any of their projects except through direct taxes, which makes them very unpopular. Politicians hate taxes. They love spending tax money. They like spending money, but they don't like collecting it through taxes, so they have to collect it through other means, which is inflation. And that's Keynesian economics, basically. So politicians like inflation. Therefore, they like Keynesian economics because it allows them to fund their programs without creating rebellion on the part of the people, because people don't realize that they're paying taxes. They think that they're being cheated by inflation, but they don't know that inflation is a hidden tax, and it's the same thing, except that they don't see it and don't understand it. So it works better for politicians. So that's why politicians like Keynesian economics, and the bankers like Keynesian economics, because it allows them to create money out of nothing and loan it not only to governments but to private borrowers, institutions, and that sort of thing. And banks make their money only on interest on loans. So the more loans they make, the more money they make, and that's why they like anything which will allow them to loan more and more money, especially if they don't have to get them. Just think about this. A bank can loan money, but if it's limited by the amount of money that it's put in deposit into the bank by investors, then that limits the amount of money a bank can loan. But if the bank could say, heck, we don't even need investors, forget the investors or the depositors, we can just create this stuff and loan it into existence. That's a much better deal for the banks. That's why the governments can go to the Federal Reserve and get these fantastic loans for billions of dollars. The bankers love it because interest on $1 billion is not too bad, not too shabby, especially since they didn't have to do anything to get the billion. They just created it out of thin air. Interest on nothing is the reason the banks like Keynesian economics. So there you have it. If the banks like it and the governments like it and the people don't know what the heck it is, that's why we have it.
Exactly, and you're talking about money creation and how easy it is for them, to print all this extra money, whether it's banks or governments and things like that, and go on either government spending programs, or the banks can do these sophisticated yen carry trades or buy asset. They can, literally print the money up and go buy real estate or go buy stocks or go buy whatever assets they want, and they could borrow near zero. My next question has to do with deflation. We have all the people in the mainstream media, CNBC and Bloomberg, they talk about deflation incessantly, like it's this evil boogeyman, like, it'll destroy us. But the system, the way it's been created now, since the creature from Jekyll Island, since the Federal Reserve was created, it doesn't seem like they'll allow deflation for a long period of time. And from a historical standpoint, I don't really, like, you've looked at the history too. Have we seen evidence of long periods of deflation since the Federal Reserve and these other large, powerful central banks have been created?
No, we have not. And And I could stand to be corrected, I suppose. I don't have all the data right here in front of me, but I do not recall ever examining any significant period where deflation was a factor in modern economics, simply because we've been ruled. The whole world has been dominated by central banks, which in the U.S. is called the Federal Reserve, and all of these central banks have one mission, and that is to expand the money supply, to create inflation, not deflation. So when you have the power to create money and to control the economy is in the hands of people who have only one mission, which is to inflate the money supply, then it's illogical to expect to see long periods of deflation. That would be little moments of recoil, so to speak, a little ricochet here and there, but the overdriving force, the great explosive force, is for inflation. But even beyond that, the question you raise implies a deeper question. That is, why is deflation so bad? And in truth, deflation is not bad at all. It's generally considered to be bad because it's associated with a decline in the economy. Therefore, they say, since we see a decline in the economy causing deflation, therefore deflation is bad, not realizing that a deflation was the result of the decline of the economy, not the cause of it. Deflation is possible without a decline in the economy, I should say, a decline in the economy. I don't know what I said a moment ago, but anyway, I meant to say the economy. And it's a natural phenomenon in a world in which the money supply is not manipulated. As productivity increases, it should be possible for the same monetary unit, let's call it a dollar in our case, to buy more and more as time goes on. As we all know, this phenomenon in the electronic world, computers today for $300 or $400, we got far less than that 10 years ago. We would have to spend $5,000 or $6,000 for less, and that's because of increase in technology and productivity. And that, therefore, is what we expect to see across the board, maybe not as dramatically as in electronics, but literally in every field. And so a person who has a dollar saved 10 years from now should be able to buy more with that dollar than he could today. And that's a good thing. It does not cause a decline in the economy. What causes a decline in the economy is the bursting of the bubble, the expansion of the money supply, and then the bursting of it and the contraction of the money supply and the contraction of credit and the disruptive effect on employment and distribution and marketing. Those are the things that are to be avoided. And the idea of deflation is a result of that. And it's not the cause of that. And so these economists, so-called, who are saying, well, we got to avoid deflation, had better go back to their history books and re-examine this difference between cause and effect.
Well, I think, if they're fighting deflation, if they have this war on deflation, if they make deflation the enemy and the boogeyman, it allows them to continue inflating when they can say, the real inflation rate is 1% right now and we're fighting deflation, right, which is what they're saying right now, when the real inflation rate is obviously higher than that. I agree with you. I don't see a problem with deflation at all. I want more for less with my money. I want more purchasing power. If prices for movie tickets and, prices for electronics items I need to be more productive in my everyday life and my business that I'm growing, if those things can benefit me, then I'm all for those. If I can hire for my small business here, if I can hire more workers at a better price, if their wages are falling and there's more talented, highly competitive workers, I can add to my company, then that sounds beneficial to me. But yet the people in power keep telling me and repeating that it's not, and that it's wrong and things like that. So it defies logic and common sense, a lot of the stuff what the people in power say.
Yeah, well, they're trying to make it sound, as you say, that deflation is the boogeyman, and it's not. But by making it believable, and by saying that they are fighting deflation by deliberately creating controlled inflation, then even though they're stealing us blind and they are real predators, they're able to walk around with their chests puffed out, and they pose as heroes instead. And that's the game that they're playing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I want to talk now about the Edward Snowden revelations, and we're seeing these academic papers come out from IMF economists about, debating a cashless society where they can record all transactions, so people have to use either credit card or debit card, and they can tax all these transactions. These same economists are also talking about bail-ins now, because now bailouts have such a negative connotation after 2008. There were people came out with the pitchforks. Are we heading towards a full totalitarian police state, in your opinion, where, people are trying to control, everything, all of our purchases, everything we think, all of our actions and behavior, full central planning, kind of basically what I guess Marx wanted in his Utopia?
Yes, we are definitely moving in that direction. We've been moving in that direction for quite a while, which takes us back to one of the earlier issues. At what point that started is debatable, but certainly by the time of the Wilson administration, it was fully evident, and it was sort of a straight line progression. Actually, it's not really a straight line anymore. It's sort of exponential. Yeah, we're moving in that direction, and only a fool could say that we're not. And we have to say that unless there's some change in the force of this movement, we're going to get there. If you're heading for something and you keep moving in that direction and you don't change either your direction of motion or your speed, you're going to get there. So the obvious question is, well, when do we get to full totalitarianism? And my answer is it doesn't make too much difference. We're heading there, and we're very close to it now, so close that it feels extremely uncomfortable to those of us who remember a more open society. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, we're heading that way. There's no question about it. But I suppose the underlying question is, well, can it be averted? Is there anything we can do to prevent ourselves from reaching the end of that line? And the answer, of course, it can. Next question. Well, what is it? Well, there are two ways. There are two ways to bring about a revolution is what this is. It's not necessarily a violent revolution. In fact, that's the very issue we're talking about. This is a revolution primarily of ideas, but ideas are transformed into actions. And so when you finally get down to the point where the actions are so uncomfortable, how do you reverse them? Do you reverse them with counter actions or counter ideas? Okay? Well, I really believe that the only way to reverse this trend is through counter ideas. If we try and meet force with force, I think it's a losing game. It's certainly a bloody game. And I think under the present conditions, it's a losing game, too, because the powers of totalitarianism around the world now have weapons that are so powerful that I'm sure most people have no idea what kind of weapons really exist, haven't yet been used to any large extent. Back in the days when the American Revolution was fought, why the British had their muskets and the Americans had their muskets. They all had muskets, the same muskets. They all did the same range. They fired the same size bullets pretty much. Everybody took the same amount of time to reload, and it was sort of even on both sides, depending on how many muskets there were. Those were the days when numbers counted. Now, one man with his finger on a red switch can blast away a whole city. One man with his finger on a button can release a canister that will dump deadly viruses and bacteriological components onto a whole region. One man can turn a knob and aim an electronic beam at a crowd of people and literally fry them on the inside from a distance, things like that. So it's no longer even. And unfortunately, the powers of totalitarianism have those kinds of weapons at their disposal. So I honestly think that anyone who thinks they're going to turn this around by meeting force with force is on the wrong track. But there's nothing more powerful than an idea. And I believe that an idea whose time has come is the idea that collectivism is got to be replaced by individualism. Those are words that are probably unfamiliar to many people, but they are the root words, the words that everybody should be familiar with. We are in a war around the world between these two basic ideologies, collectivism on the one side individualism on the other. Collectivism is the generic term for all of those concepts of totalitarianism that we know in the modern world, such as communism, fascism, Nazism, all of the isms that declare that the state is all-powerful and should be all-powerful, that the group is more important than the individual, that the individual must be sacrificed for the greater good of the greater number. All of those ideologies are under the heading of collectivism. And on the other side, individualism is the concept which was the foundation of our great country, the concept that the state is to be the servant of the people. And that is the basic conflict. And if we get enough of our people to realize the underlying ideological chasm and the importance of understanding what these words mean, we can turn it around with a revolution of ideas. I think it's the only way to go, and it can be done. And for anybody who's interested, by the way, in how I think it can be done, I urge them to come to a website for an organization that we created about 2012, I guess it was. No, it's 2002. Excuse me, I got my dates way by 2002, and it was called Freedom Force International. So read all about it, as they say. Go to wp.freedomforceinternational.org. And you can see what the master plan is, and we call it that, the ideal, the plan to bring about a change in the world in a bloodless revolution, a revolution of ideas.
The Freedom Manifesto?
Yes, the Freedom Manifesto. You're right on target. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. Information and education is our best shot here to try to wake people up. And, it's easier to convince one person than to convince, tens of thousands or millions of people, because then the one person will tell another person, and then it'll spread like that. It'll go viral. It's a lot easier to do that than trying to wake up so many different people. And, it's exactly like you said, and you can't win with violence because they can print money literally out of thin air, unlimited amounts of it. And, they control the mainstream media. So they make, they could basically, most of the people will believe almost anything the mainstream media says, unfortunately, right now. At least a large percentage of the population, well, maybe not all of them, but at least a good amount. So, it's going to turn the tides. I guess what Alex Jones says is an information war right now. So you're definitely one of the original forefathers there with your book, Creature from Jekyll Island, which is, I think, a great book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
My final question before I let you go, you talk in your book a lot about the Council on Foreign Relations, yet I never hear it mentioned on the mainstream media, really. How powerful are they?
Well, the Council on Foreign Relations is extremely powerful. How powerful, let's say, I don't know. Some people call it the hidden government of the United States. I think that underplays the importance of it. I think the Council on Foreign Relations represents a power structure that is more important than governments. I think it represents a power structure that exists in most countries around the world, this little oligarchy that the public doesn't see, that really determines who is in power. There's always an oligarchy behind the scenes that selects the candidates, that determines the topics for public debate, that determines what is politically correct, that determines the educational curricula, and so forth. And governments are the instruments or the tools of these people, but the people themselves often are not in government. Or if they are in government, they have a higher loyalty or higher affinity than just being in government. The Council on Foreign Relations is one of those groups. It's the one in the United States that is the most dominant. So to answer your question, how powerful is it? I'd say it is the most powerful group in the United States.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's very interesting, and here they are. I did a Welcome to Dystopia podcast on this, which is gallows humor. I did a one recently about how in their magazine, I think Foreign Policy, that the Council on Foreign Relations just put out, they're talking about robotics and automation and how most people are going to lose their jobs in the next couple decades to that, and there's really nothing that they can do about it. So I guess that's what the elites, the powers that be, have planned, to roll out with this cheap, artificially cheap capital and politicians forcing wages higher is these businesses now are going to start making investments in robotics and innovation to start taking away the jobs of the middle class.
Well, that's an interesting thought. I've been hearing that, and I guess there's some truth to it, but I cannot help but relate that back to the cry a little over a century ago, when everybody was afraid that the arrival of the automobile would take away jobs, because all the people that made buggy whips and all the people who ran horse stables and, all of the employment that had built up around horses as a means of transportation, they were concerned that they would all lose their jobs, which they did. But they could not foresee that the rise of a new industry like the automobile would create more jobs by far than the ones that were lost. I have a feeling, although I haven't studied this in depth, I have a feeling that this robotics industry would wind up creating more jobs by far than the ones that are going to be lost. But that's not the important thing, how many jobs are created and lost. The important thing is who is going to control the robotics and how they will be programmed and how dependent human beings will be made upon them by law. Not freedom of choice, but because some legislator has said this robot is smarter than you, and it will determine whether you will want to drive down the freeway at 35 miles an hour or 45 miles an hour. It will determine whether you get to go to Cincinnati to visit your sister, because we will program all of these robots, and you must do what they do. That's the thing that scares me, not the job issue.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think people eventually adapt to robots, so there might be some job losses, like you said initially, but the economy will adapt. But I think a lot of people are worried that pure artificial intelligence is going to be created, and the robots are going to decide, you're killing the planet or something like that, and we're just going to wipe you out. I think they've seen maybe too many science fiction movies, or that's decades away. But that's a discussion for another time, I guess.
Yeah, well, we do know on that topic that there will always be people programming the robots. Of course, theoretically, the robots can program themselves. I suppose that's theoretically true. But for a very long time, there will be humans programming those robots, and the values that will be programmed into them will be determined by the programmers. So the ones who will be eliminated because they're not good citizens, so to speak, that will be based on an algorithm that was human created. And you can bet that the people that created those algorithms will not be included in the list to be exterminated.
Great. Now, the Creature from Jekyll Island, I read it on Audible audiobook unabridged. That was great for putting it out there on audiobook. Thank you very much. Where else can our listeners go to buy the book?
Well, thanks for that. We have a website, and we sell that book plus about 100 other books and recordings on topics related to this. And our commercial site is called Reality Zone. So that's www.realityzone.com. And you'll find it all there.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to thank you for our time. I really enjoyed our discussion of history and all the different topics about freedom. I really appreciate it. And I didn't get to most of our topics because you and me started talking about a lot of interesting historical stuff, and we'll have to have you back on to talk about some of my other questions.
Very good, Jason. Thanks for inviting me, and good luck with reaching a lot of people with the truth. I'm all on your side. Thank you.
Okay, great.